I did not die on the battlefield, and that was the first mistake the Imperium ever made with me, because in the 41st millennium death is often a mercy and survival is a debt that must be repaid in suffering. Yet when my eyes opened, I was still breathing, still conscious, staring up at a sky that was not a sky at all, but a cracked dome of armored glass through which a pale, artificial dawn filtered in sickly shades of grey. For a few long seconds, I simply lay there on the ash-covered ground, unsure if I was alive or trapped in the Emperor's final judgment, because the last thing I remembered was the sound of orbital strikes tearing our regiment apart, and Sergeant Kale screaming for us to hold the line even as the horizon vanished in nuclear light, and men do not usually wake after that. The air tasted wrong in my lungs, thin, recycled, carrying the metallic tang of filtration systems that had been running far longer than they were ever meant to, and that alone told me I was not on an open world but inside some kind of sealed structure. Perhaps a macrodome or an ancient planetary facility left behind by an age when the Imperium still cared enough to terraform its dead planets. When I pushed myself upright, my muscles trembled from dehydration and shock, and grey dust slid from my uniform in soft cascades, revealing the torn crest of the 117th Carskin rifles still clinging to my chest like a stubborn memory. Around me lay the bodies of my squad, not burned or torn apart as I expected from orbital bombardment, but desiccated, their flesh drawn tight against bone as if the very moisture had been leached from them by years of slow decay rather than moments of violent death. And that was when I realized something impossible. They had been dead far longer than I had been unconscious. Panic should have taken me then, but instead a strange, fragile sense of relief crept into my chest. Because if the dome was still sealed and its atmosphere still breathable, then someone or something had maintained this place, and that meant I was not entirely alone in the galaxy. I called out, my voice cracking in the stale air, half expecting only echoes to answer me, yet from somewhere beyond a collapsed hab block at the far end of the plaza came a faint metallic clatter followed by silence, the kind of silence that suggested something had heard me and was deciding whether or not I was worth approaching. That single sound was enough to ignite hope inside me, irrational and desperate, the kind of hope soldiers cling to when they have nothing else left, and I staggered toward it with all the caution my training allowed, stepping over fallen Lazarfals and broken ration crates, past a statue of the God Emperor that had been shattered at the waist so that his stone torso lay staring sightlessly into the dust while his outstretched arms still pointed toward a cathedral door that no longer existed. The plaza had once been a center of civilian life. There were market stalls petrified in mid-collapse, children's toys half buried in ash, and the skeletal remains of what must have been thousands of colonists clustered near the edges, as if they had tried to flee when disaster struck. Yet the emptiness of the space was more oppressive than the bodies, because each corpse, each broken toy, each ruin screamed a quiet testimony of survival without salvation. And then I saw it, a movement along the far wall, something slight and metallic, almost human in rhythm but wrong, and my heart froze because the only thing in the galaxy that could survive in that dead atmosphere and still move like that was something designed to kill or something older, waiting for prey. I froze, listening to the scraping of metal against stone, the faint hiss of air being drawn through a filter somewhere beyond my sight, and in that moment I understood the first real law of the place. You do not survive by being brave, you survive by being unseen, unheard, and by convincing yourself that the only thing worse than death is watching it come for someone else while you are forced to remain alive. I forced my legs to move, shuffling toward a shadowed corridor where the sound seemed to originate, and as I approached, I noticed the walls lined with alcoves, each containing the skeletal remains of long-dead guardsmen and civilians alike, some with arms raised in silent screams, some curled like broken infants, and one, in particular, caught my eye. A single, empty restraint frame twisted open, the metal bent as though something of enormous strength had pulled itself free, and a crude message scratched into the wall beside it read, "It learns your voice. Do not speak after it hears you." I swallowed hard, realizing that my initial shouts had been a signal, not a plea, and that whatever awaited me beyond the corridor now knew I was alive, and I had made a mistake, the first of many. The air grew colder as I stepped further in, a mechanical draft whispering down the passage, carrying with it a faint metallic odor that reminded me of my own blood, dried and caked to the inside of my armor, and I felt the weight of isolation pressing down on me, heavier than any pack of gear I had carried in training, heavier than the artillery barrages that had ended my regiment, because now, surrounded by centuries of death, I understood that this place did not merely kill it, watched, it remembered, and it would wait until I made a misstep. And yet, despite the terror clawing at my chest, I felt an irrational thread of hope, because if the place had maintained breathable air, If the filtering systems had not failed completely, then perhaps survival was still possible, and I forced myself onward, each step measured, each breath calculated, the shadows of the dead stretching along the walls like spectral hands reaching for me, until I reached a junction where the corridor split into darkness, one path descending toward the heart of the facility, the other rising toward what looked like the remnants of a maintenance deck. And I had to choose, knowing full well that each choice might be a sentence to death or a passage to something worse. And as I paused there, the sound of faint scraping returned, slower this time, deliberate, as if whatever was watching had stepped closer. And I realized then that hope in this place was not a comfort but a weapon, a fragile illusion to keep the mind awake while it prepared to endure horrors beyond imagination. The corridor swallowed me in darkness the moment I stepped inside, and the faint hiss of the ventilation system became a low, insistent whisper that seemed to echo directly into my skull. A reminder that I was not only alone but being observed, that every movement, every breath, every nervous tremor of my hands might already be catalogued and judged by something beyond comprehension. The walls themselves were pocked with centuries of scars, deep gouges from claws that could not have belonged to anything human, and every few meters the floor shifted from cracked concrete to metal plating warped by heat and time, creaking under my weight as if complaining at the audacity of a living being daring to cross its expanse. Shadows danced along the edges of my vision, shapes that my mind tried to rationalize as twisted support beams or fallen debris, yet the rhythm of their movement was too deliberate, too fluid, to be anything so mundane, and I found myself gripping the hilt of my combat knife, knuckles white, training screaming at me to listen for the faintest hint of respiration, to catch the weight of air moving unnaturally. And that was when I first heard it, not a sound I could recognize but a vibration in the floor, low and resonant, like the heartbeat of a machine older than the Imperium itself, a heartbeat that thudded in time with my own and made the hair on my neck stand rigid. I wanted to turn back, to flee into the plaza and pray that whatever had been watching me would remain hidden, but my feet moved forward, drawn by something I could not name, a curiosity born of despair, because to do nothing was to surrender to the silence. And in this place, silence was the most dangerous predator. As I advanced, the walls began to display the evidence of long-dead inhabitants' alcoves containing skeletal remains still clad in tattered uniforms, faces frozen in silent terror, hands reaching as if trying to claw their way out of some invisible trap, and a chilling sense of familiarity gripped me. For in those frozen faces I saw echoes of my squad, of Kale, of men I had sworn to protect, yet now were nothing more than hollow monuments to mortality. A metallic scraping echoed again from somewhere ahead, deliberate and measured, and I pressed myself against the wall, listening as my pulse quickened, the sound approaching with a cadence that was almost sentient, the rhythm suggesting thought behind action, and I felt the terror that comes not from knowing death is near, but from knowing that it is calculating, patient, and uninterested in mercy. I took a step forward, then another, careful to distribute my weight evenly, my senses straining to interpret the faint hum of the air filters, the distant clatter of some mechanism deep within the facility, the occasional shift of dust that betrayed movement just beyond my vision, and each step carried with it a memory of the battlefield, of men screaming as fire consumed their flesh. Yet those screams were distant now, replaced by a quieter horror, a horror that spoke not of death but of endurance, of surviving in a world where every breath could be your last. The corridor opened into a small chamber, its ceiling low and pocked with rust, and in the center was a console long abandoned, its lights dead, wires dangling like veins, and beside it a series of humanoid shapes huddled unnaturally close, covered in blackened fabric, forms that might once have been men or women, now twisted and contorted into poses that defied anatomy, and I realized with a sickening clarity that they were not corpses in the conventional sense. Their skin glistened faintly under the dim light, still absorbing what little moisture remained in the atmosphere, and their eyes where they had once been were hollow, reflecting only the shadowed shapes around them. Yet I could feel them watching, aware of my presence, calculating whether I was prey or an intruder unworthy of attention. I pressed on, stepping over the threshold with care, and as I moved, the sound of metallic scraping returned, closer now, circling the chamber in a pattern that suggested strategy, and I understood that I was not alone here in a simple, physical sense. The place itself was alive in a way the Imperium rarely allowed for human comprehension, a lattice of metal and memory of programmed defense and something older, something that had waited eons for a living being to stumble into its domain. My mind raced as I tried to reconcile what I was seeing with what I had been taught to believe, that the universe was a place of wars and heroes, of honor and duty, But here, those concepts seemed absurd, trivial, irrelevant against the reality of enduring alone against a creditor that did not hunger for flesh alone but for hope. And I understood that survival would require more than skill or courage. It would require deception, cunning, and the willingness to let every instinct I had honed over decades be repurposed for fear and silence. And yet, despite the oppression of the place, a small, irrational ember of hope remained. For if I could navigate this chamber, if I could avoid the eyes that watched and the metal claws that waited, then perhaps I could survive. Perhaps I could find the source of the life-maintaining systems that had kept this tomb artificially breathable. Perhaps there was a way to turn the machinery, the intelligence of this place, to my advantage, and I pressed on, each step a negotiation with terror, each breath a battle against panic, the scraping growing louder, circling closer, and as I reached the far wall I noticed a hatch, partially open, just wide enough for me to squeeze through, and with a careful glance over my shoulder at the twisted, observing shapes, I slipped inside, finding myself in a maintenance shaft whose walls hummed with the faint energy of ancient generators, and I understood that the choice I had made was dangerous but necessary, that to remain in the open corridor was to surrender to inevitability, and as I crawled through the narrow space, dust filling my lungs and scraping my skin raw, I could not help but feel that I was part of something older than the Imperium itself, part of a cycle of observation and death and endurance, and that the only way to survive was to embrace the terror, to move through it as a shadow, silent, invisible, and patient, knowing that the next misstep could end not only my life but the fragile hope that had, against all reason, sparked within me when I first opened my eyes in this tomb, and that hope, irrational and desperate, was now both my weapon and my curse, guiding me forward into the unknown darkness of a place that had claimed countless others, yet somehow, impossibly, had spared me. I emerged from the cramped maintenance shaft into a wider chamber, and the first thing that struck me was the smell, a mixture of decay, ozone, and something else, something metallic and sweet that made the back of my throat tighten. A scent that immediately told me the place was not merely abandoned, but alive in its own alien, perverse way, a living monument to death and endurance. And as my eyes adjusted to the dim glow of emergency lights flickering along the walls, I realized that the room had once been a control center of some kind, a hub for monitoring and regulating life support systems, long since corroded and twisted by neglect and the invisible hand of something older than memory, and the consoles, shattered and sparking, displayed nothing but cryptic static-filled readouts that teased at the knowledge they once contained, the kind of knowledge the Imperium would have killed to possess and yet had left behind as if it were meaningless. And in the corner, piled against the far wall, were the bodies or remnants of humans, perhaps colonists or technicians, their forms fused with metal braces, wires, and breathing apparatuses, frozen in positions that suggested struggle, but not battle, and I understood, with a sickening clarity, that their deaths had been slow, observed, and deliberate, a process meant to educate the watcher as much as to end the lives of those within. I stepped carefully over the scattered debris, my boots crunching against broken panels and glass shards, and for the first time I allowed myself to truly feel the weight of isolation pressing on my chest, a suffocating force that made each breath a conscious effort, because in all my years of campaigning, of enduring firestorms and orbital bombardments, I had never felt so utterly, soul-crushingly alone, and yet not alone, because somewhere beyond the walls, in the humming pipes and shifting shadows, something was aware of me, something that measured my fear, my hesitation, my heartbeat, and I knew that to falter would be to invite annihilation, to surrender to a predator patient enough to wait decades for prey, foolish enough to make a noise. The air ducts above me carried faint vibrations, whispers of machinery moving with mechanical intent, and I felt my teeth grit as memories of my squad came unbidden, Kale screaming, Lieutenant Mora bleeding out against a shattered doorway, Sergeant Rin cradling a dying soldier as fire swept across the landing bay, and I realized that the horrors here were not just the physical threats, but the reflection of every failure I had ever known, every life lost in my presence, and that my own survival would now be a story written in silence, in avoidance, in the careful manipulation of shadows, because brute force meant nothing against a place like this. I moved toward a console still faintly illuminated, touching it gingerly with gloved hands, and the sensors flickered to life, displaying fragmented schematics of the facility, corridors branching into sub-levels marked with symbols I recognized from Imperial archives as belonging to bio-containment units, quarantine zones, and experimental observation decks. Yet the annotations were written in languages I did not fully recognize, a mixture of High Gothic, corrupted by centuries of neglect, and some unknown script, a bastardized code of warning or instruction, and as I traced the lines with my fingers, I realized that every junction, every alcove, every chamber in this facility had been designed not only to observe, but to manipulate, to test, to break the psyche of anyone unfortunate enough to enter, and a shiver ran down my spine as the scraping returned. Louder now, deliberate, pacing the outer edges of the room in a rhythm that made my heart stutter. And I understood that I was being toyed with, assessed, and that my hope, that fragile ember I had clung to since awakening, was exactly the bait meant to keep me alive long enough for something else to learn from me. The shadows shifted, and for a fleeting instant I saw the glint of a metallic figure in the corner, humanoid in silhouette but impossibly tall, limbs slightly too long, movements too precise, and I felt a primal terror knot in my stomach because it was no ordinary machine, no standard necron or automaton I had ever read about, but something older, something whose intelligence had not been tested by human minds for centuries, if ever, and it had observed me since my first step, measuring every flinch, every twitch of muscle, and I realized that the only way to survive was to embrace deception, to move as if I belonged, as if the facility expected me, while every instinct screamed to run. I pressed further into the room, my flashlight flickering against panels scrawled with warnings, some in High Gothic, others in the strange alien script, and each symbol seemed to pulse with an almost hypnotic cadence, and I knew that this place did not merely consume bodies, it consumed attention, bending it, testing it, playing with it as a predator toys with a mouse before the kill, and yet, despite the suffocating dread, I could not stop moving, could not allow the paralysis of fear to overtake me, because to hesitate was to invite obliteration, and I forced myself along the corridor, leading from the chamber, each step measured, each breath silent, until I found a secondary hatch that led to a spiral stair descending into darkness, the walls of which were etched with further warnings and pictograms depicting humans in various states of stress and mutation, and I understood that the previous inhabitants had been experimented on, perhaps not physically, but psychologically, tested to the breaking point of endurance, and in the depth of that understanding, I felt an echo of my own vulnerability, realizing that the terror I felt was not simply external but internal, a manipulation of every memory, every regret, every fear I had carried into this tomb. I climbed down the stairs slowly, the metal groaning beneath my weight, the scraping now audible on every level of perception, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and I knew that I had entered the heart of the tomb, the core where the Watchers, whatever they were, kept the pulse of life and death in their hands, observing every heartbeat, and for the first time, I felt a desperate thrill of fear mixed with determination, because to survive here meant not only outlasting the environment and its inhabitants, but outsmarting a consciousness that had waited centuries for a chance like mine, and I realized that in the 41st millennium, the true horror was not the enemy, not the fire, not the bombs, but the quiet, unyielding intelligence that could observe, anticipate, and break a human being while leaving them alive to endure every second of their own terror. I descended, deeper into the facility, each step echoing through the narrow spiral staircase like a drumbeat marking my own funeral, and the air grew heavier, thicker, tainted with the scent of rust, ozone, and the faint, unmistakable hint of organic decay, a smell that made my stomach churn and my throat tighten as though the tomb itself were breathing around me, exhaling centuries of forgotten anguish. The walls here were no longer smooth metal but a lattice of reinforced conduits and tubes, many of them ruptured and leaking a viscous fluid that shimmered faintly in the dim light, and I realized with a creeping dread that this place had once been a site of experimentation, not on technology, but on the people it trapped, and that their suffering had been recorded, measured, and catalogued by some intelligence that existed beyond comprehension, one that observed life and death as if they were mere variables in a complex, eternal equation. My boots slipped on the slick surface, and I pressed my hand against the nearest conduit, feeling the faint vibration of something alive or, at least aware, thrumming beneath the metal, a rhythm that set my pulse racing in sympathy, and for the first time, fear was no longer an abstract sensation but a tangible presence, pressing against my skin, clawing at my mind, whispering doubts I had not known I carried, that I was already too late, that the Watchers had known I would come and were already deciding how my body would serve their purposes. I forced myself to take another step, and then another, each movement careful, deliberate, a performance designed to blend with the environment, because I understood that the corridors were alive in a way that human senses could barely comprehend, that even sound, the simplest expression of life, could betray me if used carelessly, and yet I could not remain still, for stillness was surrender, and surrender here meant becoming yet another echo among the forgotten. One more name etched into the walls in alien script that I could not read. One more body twisted into grotesque permanence for the amusement or education of the intelligence that haunted this place. As I moved forward, the corridor opened into a vast chamber, a cathedral of metal and bone. And I saw it, the center of the tomb's heart, where the Watchers maintained their dominion, a fusion of machine and architecture that radiated silent menace. Towering pillars etched with runes that pulsed faintly with energy. Walls covered in alcoves containing skeletal forms fused to machinery in poses of eternal suffering. And at the center, a dais upon which sat a figure, humanoid in shape but impossibly elongated, its limbs unnaturally jointed, skin a mixture of organic tissue and polished metal, and eyes that reflected everything yet betrayed nothing, staring at me with the patience of a being that had observed millennia pass and considered all life as inconsequential data points. My heart thundered as I realized that all the scraping, the vibrations, the subtle manipulations of the air and dust had been leading me here, that the tomb had guided me, tested me, broken me down to this single, critical moment, and I understood that survival would not come from strength or cunning alone, but from understanding, from intuition, from the fragile grasp on hope that I had managed to preserve despite everything the tomb had thrown at me. I inched closer, my breath shallow, each step a negotiation with terror, and as I did, I saw more. The walls were lined with what appeared to be recording devices, some organic, some mechanical, all pointed at the center, all observing, all feeding data into a system older than any record of the Imperium, a consciousness that measured endurance, fear, decision-making, and the very essence of being alive. And in that moment I felt the crushing realization that I was a subject, an experiment, and perhaps the first human to endure this long enough to be truly tested. I wanted to flee, to retreat back into the corridors I had come from, but the path behind me had shifted, walls sliding silently into new configurations, hallways twisting impossibly, and I understood that escape was no longer a matter of choice. It was another test, a puzzle designed to push me to my limits, to see if I could adapt, survive, and think under pressure that would break the strongest mind. The figure on the dais moved then, slowly, deliberately, limbs bending in ways that no human should, and I realized that this being had been aware of my presence from the first second I awoke in the plaza, had guided my steps, had allowed hope to flicker and then flinch, teaching me with every breath the meaning of endurance, and a part of me, foolish, desperate, part-felt, or mixed with terror, recognizing a mind older, more precise, and far more patient than my own. And yet I pressed forward, because the alternative was annihilation, and survival demanded audacity even in the face of incomprehensible horror. As I reached the base of the dais, the temperature seemed to drop, the air crystallizing around me, and the metallic figure extended a hand, not in threat, but as if testing, measuring, inviting me into a conversation I could neither understand nor refuse. And I felt the pulse of the tomb itself in response, as though the structure acknowledged my audacity, my presence, my desperate hope, and I knew then that the trial was not simply about avoiding death but about proving that life could persist, could adapt, could endure, even in the heart of a place designed to extinguish it utterly. And as I lifted my hand in cautious reciprocation, the scraping ceased, the vibrations softened, and a fragile thread of understanding, or perhaps illusion, passed between us, teaching me that the heart of the tomb was not only a place of horror but a mirror, reflecting the terror, resilience, and desperation of every being that dared to enter, and that the choice before me was no longer simple survival, but the acceptance that in this cathedral of observation, life itself was a negotiation, a gamble, and a defiance of the darkness that sought to consume all hope. I had believed that reaching the heart of the tomb was the climax of my trial, that the encounter with the figure on the dais had been the test itself. But as I stepped further into the cavernous chamber beyond, I realized that survival here was not measured in proximity to death but in the endurance of the mind, because the space I entered was a labyrinth of mirrored corridors, reflective surfaces catching and twisting my own image, multiplying me into dozens of selves that whispered in tones I could almost understand but could not fully hear, and each reflection moved slightly out of sync, a subtle, deliberate distortion that made my pulse quicken as I understood that the Watchers were no longer only observing. They were shaping perception, playing with cognition, forcing me to doubt the very nature of reality. Every turn I took, every corridor I passed, seemed to shift behind me, walls bending, floors tilting, shadows stretching unnaturally, and the scraping sound I had come to associate with the figure on the dais now moved independently, echoing from places I could not locate, circling, sometimes pausing, As if to ensure my fear remained fresh, my concentration frayed, and I realized with sinking clarity that this game was not about killing me outright. It was about breaking me into pieces, mental, emotional, spiritual, so that when the true challenge arrived, I would be stripped of everything that made me human. And yet, despite this realization, a stubborn ember of determination persisted, a whisper that told me that my awareness, my capacity to endure, might itself be the key to survival. The mirrors reflected not just me, but fragments of the past, visions of comrades lost on distant worlds, flashes of battles that had ended in fire and screaming, moments when I had failed, when men I swore to protect had died under my watch, and the walls absorbed these echoes, amplifying them, replaying them in dissonant loops that made my stomach churn and my head throb with nausea. And I understood that the Watchers were studying not my body but my memory, my regrets, my fear, and that to resist meant to fight a war not only against them but against every failure I had ever carried within myself. I stumbled forward, hands brushing against the mirrored surfaces, each touch sending ripples of light that distorted my reflection further, and with each step, I could feel the dread tighten around my chest, a physical pressure that reminded me that hope was a double-edged weapon here. It sustained life but also drew attention, a beacon for predators who measured desire as easily as pulse. Somewhere in the labyrinth, a low hum began to vibrate through the walls, rhythmic, deliberate, and I realized it was not the ventilation system but some massive, hidden machinery, ancient beyond measure, whose function was not immediately apparent but whose presence radiated authority, intelligence, and patience. And I understood then that the Watchers were not solitary but part of a network, a hive of observation that spanned the facility, absorbing data, anticipating responses, and refining their strategies in real time. And a shiver of existential terror gripped me because I had never imagined a test of survival so comprehensive, so personal, that it targeted not just life but the very essence of self. As I turned a corner, I caught sight of a figure flickering in the distance. Humanoid, indistinct, and I froze, every instinct screaming that I should run, hide, or strike. Yet a small, irrational curiosity compelled me forward, for the figure did not advance, it merely observed, and I realized that interaction, if handled with care, might provide information, a clue, a thread I could follow to survive, and I inched closer, heart hammering, muscles taut, senses heightened to a razor edge. The figure did not speak, did not move in a way that could be considered humanly intentional, yet I felt a pulse of awareness, a communication of sorts that transcended language, telling me that my endurance was noted, my awareness registered, and that the next step I took would be consequential beyond comprehension. It was a test of intuition, not strength, and I knew that a single misjudgment could unravel every ounce of progress I had made. I passed through a narrow alcove, and the reflections in the mirrors multiplied exponentially, until I was surrounded by dozens of phantom selves, each one whispering memories, fears, desires, a cacophony of internal dialogue externalized. And I forced myself to breathe evenly, to suppress panic, to remind myself that reality was subjective here, malleable, and that maintaining clarity of mind was as vital as any weapon I had ever held. The scraping grew louder, closer, circling the labyrinth, and I realized that it had rhythm, purpose, and intelligence, as if the Watcher was playing a game of cat and mouse, seeing how long I could endure the sensory assault before instinct took over. And I understood that I had to anticipate, to manipulate, to use the illusions against themselves, moving deliberately, leaving false traces, pausing in certain shadows, advancing in others, a dance dictated by fear and survival. And then, in a sudden moment of clarity, I noticed something the Watchers had overlooked, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration in the floor beneath my right foot, a subtle change in resonance that suggested structural weakness, a conduit that could be exploited to redirect attention or even access another level. And I realized that survival in the Watcher's game required more than endurance. It demanded creativity, observation, and a willingness to risk everything to turn the Predator's own design against it. I shifted my weight, tested the floor, and a portion of the mirrored wall slid silently away, revealing a passage barely wide enough to pass through, and I slipped inside, heart hammering, lungs burning, aware that each step was being monitored, calculated, and analyzed. And I understood that the Watchers were not omnipotent but meticulous, and that inattention, arrogance, or hesitation could be fatal. And yet the ember of hope burned brighter than ever, because if I could reach this passage undetected, perhaps I could reach the next stage, the next opportunity to survive, and perhaps just perhaps turn the tables on the game itself. The scraping ceased for a moment as I entered, replaced by a low hum that resonated in my chest rather than my ears. and I felt an almost imperceptible acknowledgement of my audacity, a recognition that survival was possible, but only if I maintained focus, discipline, and the fragile hope that had kept me alive through every night of desolation, every echo of the forgotten, every shadow among the dead. And as I moved deeper into the passage, I realized that the Watcher's game was not simply a test of life, but a test of essence, a challenge to endure, adapt, and emerge with the mind, body, and spirit intact, even when the universe itself conspired to undo you. The passage led me into a chamber so vast that my lights barely penetrated the darkness, and the air itself felt alive, thick with the memory of suffering, vibrating with a resonance that made every nerve ending in my body hum with anticipation and dread. The walls were alive with glyphs and markings I could not fully comprehend, pulsating faintly as though in rhythm with the heartbeat of the facility itself, and I realized that every step I had taken to survive this tomb had been anticipated, measured, and evaluated. And yet here, at the edge of its heart, I felt the first stirrings of true agency, the fragile, dangerous hope that I could influence the outcome rather than simply endure it. Shadows moved across the floor, not cast but self-contained, slithering forms that seemed to watch and react independently, and as I advanced, I could feel them tracing my movements, predicting, learning, teaching me simultaneously that every action mattered, every hesitation could be exploited, and that the cost of miscalculation was not simply death but an extension of the mental torment the tomb had perfected over centuries. I pressed on, senses stretched to their limits, ears straining for the faintest sound of breathing, metal grinding, or the unnatural rhythm of the Watcher's machinery, and in the distance I saw it, the core of the tomb, a massive monolithic structure that radiated energy both mechanical and organic, fused in a way that made my stomach twist, and I understood that this was the source, the center from which the intelligence, the observation, the perverse games of endurance, radiated, and that to survive, I had to confront it, understand it, manipulate it, or succumb entirely. As I approached, I saw the remnants of previous explorers, humans and others, their bodies encased in a mixture of metal, crystal, and flesh, preserved and contorted in poses of silent agony or forced contemplation. And I realized that each had been both subject and teacher, their reactions feeding the intelligence that now awaited me, measuring my response, testing my limits, shaping the final stage of the experiment, and a cold realization gripped me. Survival would demand not only cunning and bravery, but a complete surrender to the calculation, a willingness to act within parameters defined by a mind beyond my understanding, to use fear as a weapon rather than an enemy. My hands shook as I activated the control panel embedded in the monolith, and the hum of energy surged through me, a sensation of both exhilaration and revulsion as data streamed into my mind. Images of centuries past, simulations of countless deaths, flashes of human agony, triumph, and endurance, all compressed into a single, overwhelming pulse. And I understood that the tomb did not simply observe it, assimilate it, it learned, it evolved, and my survival depended on my ability to interface with it without losing myself entirely. The shadows coalesced then, forming figures familiar yet grotesque, echoes of my own fears and memories, distorted to perfection, and they whispered warnings, pleas, and commands that rattled the edges of my sanity, forcing me to reconcile every instinct, every regret, every trauma, every hope I had clung to since the plaza, since the corridors, since the heart of the tomb. And I realized that survival was not measured by escape, but by mastery of oneself, by enduring fear and converting it into clarity and action. I manipulated the monolith's interface carefully, choosing sequences that aligned with the patterns I had observed in the Watcher's behavior, and with each correct choice, the chamber seemed to respond, glyphs pulsing more steadily, shadows pausing, the oppressive resonance lightening just enough to allow conscious thought, and I knew that I was on the precipice of understanding, of achieving something no previous human had, influence over the intelligence itself, not merely endurance, but with understanding came cost. The energy that flowed into me burned, both physically and mentally, memories mingling with the tomb's own ancient knowledge. My mind stretched across centuries, across horrors and triumphs, and I felt the weight of lives I had never known, lives consumed to perfect this game, and I realized that surviving here meant absorbing a fragment of this legacy, a permanent alteration of my mind, a price that could never be repaid, yet without which I would not leave the tomb alive. I acted decisively then, directing energy flows, activating circuits that had been dormant for centuries, and the monolith pulsed in recognition, shadows retreating into the walls, and I felt the Watcher's presence recede just enough to breathe, yet never disappear, reminding me that survival here was not victory, only continuation, a fragile extension of life that demanded vigilance, cunning, and resilience beyond any natural limit. And in that moment, I allowed myself the smallest, almost forbidden breath of triumph, knowing that I had endured, and adapted and navigated, and navigated and navigated and navigated and navigated, adapted and navigated, adapted and navigate loader and babbit to pebbly and lemon pleo and plea bimim turpant and permanent and bupper cloaker and permin man and propon prepro and bunmin I pro and pleb problem of will and prefer back per I pupper farm of differs I prefer pep where I got a pep at far pub of a pillow but a galoo I thought upper curve go where to be slow with a pebble and forgot double with a map of with between the lab with a bird work more different and one of that muffin silver up into the slan and act family in my but and as I stepped away from the monolith, the chamber shifting around me to form a clear exit, I realized that survival had a price not measured in coin or favor, but in awareness, in memory, in the acceptance that the universe would continue to test, to observe, to consume, and that life itself was the reward, tenuous, delicate, yet undeniable, and I carried that realization with me as I moved toward the exit, toward the faint glimmer of light that promised the outside world, knowing that the tomb would remain endless, patient, eternal, and that I had survived not by defeating it, but by understanding it, enduring it, and accepting the cost of life in a universe defined by observation, horror, and the unyielding march of the 41st millennium.